Good morning, everybody. It's Mr. Banks. Today, I'm going to be going over my Vietnam mini lesson number 1. This is for American history. Just wanted to go over Supplemental Learning Activity 6. It's going to be due next Saturday, April 25th. If you need a little extra time, just reach out and we can talk about it. This learning activity currently will have 3 main parts. It'll have a mini lecture on the 5 Ps of war and also kind of the beginning and parameters of the Vietnam War, the Vietnam conflict. It'll have a reading portion from Lessons of Vietnam, and I'll go over where you can find these activities here in just a minute, and a short formative assessment at the end of this particular unit. You can find these on Canvas inside our learning portal. Now, on the unit number 1, before doing any reading, please do the following, okay? And this one's important here. The 5 Ps of war segment. You're going to define these in your own words, okay? Like power. And just so you know kind of what's going on in my brain, you know, in regards to power. First and foremost, I'm gonna do this. Power is an action defined as or from a person, group, or other entity in regards in regards to their interactions. How about that? Excuse me. That was 3 in a row. Anyway, this would be kind of defined in my own words. Later on, I'm going to have you look up these power, prestige, principle, profit, and protection. Later, again, I'm going to be having you list those in order of significance at the beginning or the start of the Vietnam conflict and throughout. So it's important that you do this. Always important to define it in your own words, though. You know, when you hear the word power, prestige, principle, profit, and protection, the 5 Ps, and these are the 5 Ps of war that we're looking at. It's always important to be able to generally rationalize what your definition is of these terms before you get the terms, you know, from like like dictionary.com, Wikipedia, whatever. I want you to make sure that you do these in your own words. Okay, that's important. Now, the second thing that I'm going to have you do is read pages 11 through 27 on lessons of Vietnam. And again, if it appears to be overwhelming, it's not meant to be that way. Okay, it's not meant to be overwhelming, and I'll go through this PDF here in a little bit. The mini lecture for this week is slides 1 through 21. This is what I'm going to be talking about and taking you through this mini lecture together. So this will be kind of our together portion of this particular assignment. The formative assessment we'll talk about probably probably on Tuesday or Thursday next week during our Zoom meeting. So that's just an FYI there. Okay. I'm going to remove that from the stream. Okay. And I'm going to screen share the lessons of Vietnam so you have an idea of what it's going to look like. Excuse me. Allergies are setting in. Okay. So we know that we're going to go through here and we're going to look at chapter 1, basically. Oops. Get a chance. The chapter 1 is Introduction to Vietnam, the land, history, and culture, and this is the portion of the lecture, the mini lecture that we're going to talk about today. So anyway, it says it's on page 1, but it's not. Okay, so you have to go to. If I click here, it's page 11 on the PDF. Introduction to Vietnam, land, history, culture. Read through there. There's a lot of great primary source documents, and it's going to explain. Why, you know, when we look at the aspect called the Vietnam conflict, why it was so important that the people that lived in this area, you know, it was so important that they didn't lose their rights, their individual civil liberties, this, that, and the other. But anyway, that's where you can find that particular PDF, and it's on Canvas, okay, under Lessons of Vietnam. Okay, so I got to, I don't want to tell you what, the screen sharing thing sometimes is relatively difficult. Okay, so let's get into our mini lecture, shall we? Did I click on the right one? Yes, I did. All right. So we're gonna go through here. Now, again, it may appear to be overwhelming because there are 88 particular pages associated with this unit, but I want to make sure that I get through here and discuss it. Anytime that I talk about the Vietnam conflict, I always show this picture, associated with the land. Okay, and I love to talk about the background of the conflict. If you were to describe this particular picture, I'm sure that you would be saying, "Man, it's beautiful. It's almost tropical. It looks like a pretty peaceful area." However, what we're going to find as the United States becomes involved in this conflict, that it was anything but that beauty. Okay, but Vietnam in general, if you were to look at it today and prior to that conflict, it was a very beautiful place. Okay, all right. Slide 2, Chinese occupation. Now, anytime that we look at Vietnam in general, we have to understand the logistic importance, or this, that, and the other. Anytime that we look at background, okay, we look at the Vietnam conflict, we have to first and foremost look back to our discussions in class and our research on the Cold War. The Cold War itself, we look at democracy and communism, and you've heard me like a broken record. Democracy and communism, or capitalism and communism, both call for the destruction of one another. So this was a battle of ideologies, a battle of differences that caused a lot of content and issues. So why Vietnam? China occupied Vietnam for roughly almost 1,000 years. It's hard to even wrap our heads around this. And we're going to talk about these aspects. So why Vietnam? Farmers could grow 2 crops of rice per year, creating an agricultural abundance. Could you imagine if like us in Lee County could grow 2 crops of corn or 2 crops of soybeans per year? How important would this area of the United States be in today's terminology? Well, Vietnam was that. It had a plethora of opportunity in regards to rice production, which in sustainability and how the nation's going to interact and go through. It was extremely important. Well, anyway, this tempted China to invade the Red River Delta area in around 200 BC. And you know what? You look at the aspect of natural resources or raw materials or things suitable. If you could feed your nation, and it was an important area, that's why it was so important to when we look at first with the Chinese occupation. Later on, it would be a little bit different with France, when France's imperialistic nature and colonization of Southeast Asia, but it was definitely a start. Okay, the second one here, China. Okay, 1,000 years of limited occupation. They struggled for authority in the region, within those 1,000 years, and the Vietnamese resisted. Okay, they resisted, and this was not limited to independence from China in 939 A.D. And then 1400, you had a resurgence of Chinese control in the region. So China was constantly in control of that particular region. What's interesting when we look at the Vietnam War, okay, or you look at the Cold War in general, and you even look at the issues, with foreign policy today, the United States, China, Russia, all of those nations, although it's still, it's not deemed as a Cold War, they still have issues with one another on an international level. But it started in this aspect. Well, Vietnamese did resist and win limited independence from the Chinese in 939. But if you were to do the math there, you're seeing, roughly 450 some odd years. It's not a whole lot of time when you look at the independence in that region. Well, anyway, what many people do not understand is that there was a Vietnamese empire. Okay, and here's the extravagating fact that the Vietnamese would look back at how they handled things, militarily with the Chinese, and they would use it to establish that type of, foster for independence against France and later on the United States. Le Loi, he was the first Vietnamese emperor, so to say. He was Vietnam's military leader. He took up arms resisting the Chinese by guerrilla warfare tactics. Peasants by day, arms to attack by night. What's interesting is this is the aspect that we're going to see later on, in the vocabulary term. And if you want to write this down, you can. The Viet Cong, and the Viet Cong would be peasants by day, soldiers by night. In 1428, Le Loi won independence, and he became the first emperor of the area. However, it was kind of a short-lived situation. There was a surge of European imperialism in the mid-1800s and the battle for stability prior to World War I. And if you were in Mr. Swanson's class, you know that World War I was nothing but a huge battle or land grab, aspect of colonization and imperialism. So there was a surge of European imperialism in the mid-1800s. There was stubborn resistance with, and this is many generations after Le Loi would become the first emperor. There was a stubborn resistance, but the French eventually won out. 1883, the Vietnamese were forced to grant France complete control over their country. Okay, Vietnam was later combined with Laos, Cambodia, to form French Indochina, which was one of the richest colonial possessions. They had rubber, tin, lots of things and aspects, natural resources that would be important in, the aspect of war or the aspect of sustaining, a society. Okay, and we'll definitely look at those aspects. But one thing you'll see on a future formative assessment would be, what are the three nations that would be deemed French Indochina? And you're going to want to know it's Laos, Cambodia, and Vietnam. So there was again a push for Vietnamese independence with the French. Okay, the rise of Dien Bien Phu or Ho Chi Minh. His name is He Who Enlightens Us. What's interesting about Ho Chi Minh is he's definitely going to be demonized in Western culture, but he was someone, and again, I look back at this Vietnam era, and you see, again, communism versus capitalism, both calling for the destruction of one another. So each and every ideology is definitely against one another. But Dien Bien Phu, he would later take the name Ho Chi Minh, which means He Who Enlightens Us. He studies in China and the Soviet Union during the 20s and 30s. And for those of you that know, again, when we look back at the beginnings of the Cold War, we know the Bolshevik Revolution takes place, to oust the Romanovs in Russia. The battle of communist ideology, this, that, and the other. And then you had China, the rise of Mao Zedong against Chiang Kai-shek, the nationalist the United States would support. He studied there. And the biggest reason is that this is his general area, in Asia or, within Southeast Asia predominantly. With Japan's occupation of Indochina, Ho reacted with nationalism. He did not want to have another, Asian, empire trying to tell Vietnam what to do. And this aspect of nationalism is where you kind of you look at the United States or your particular country within the term nationalism, and you would even give your life for that particular ideology. So that push for nationalism. France and the Viet Minh would go to war. There was a secret return to Vietnam in 1941. Organized a resisted movement called the League for Independence of Vietnam, or the Viet Minh, and this is Ho Chi Minh. That's he's going to return to Vietnam in 1941 after learning from the Russians and the Chinese government for around 20 years. When Japan withdrew from Indochina, the Viet Minh declared independence. September 2nd, 1945, Ho spoke to more than 500,000 people on that particular date. And as planes were flying overhead, It's noted that Ho Chi Minh recited the Declaration of Independence. Where they were going to become their own nation and form it and run it. So it's important to look at that date, of significance. So anyway, to gain U.S. support, Ho recited again the language that echoed the Declaration of Independence. As the speech ended, U.S. fighter planes could be seen flying overhead, signaling support for Ho and the Viet Minh. Now, signaling, and hope, that's pretty important. When war broke out again with France, Ho Chi Minh pleaded for help with the United States several times, but President Truman, seeing France as a viable ally, especially with World War II, in the stopping of the spread of communism, ignored Ho's pleas for help. I have pleads up there. I don't know why I have the pleads, but it's important again to look back at that component of communism and capitalism. They call for the destruction of one another, and France seemed to be more of an ally when it came or within that ideology. So it's important to look at that. There was a fear of communism in Southeast Asia that, it definitely blasted things through. Mao Zedong's communist control of China in 1949, pushing Chiang Kai-shek to Chinese Taipei or modern-day Taiwan. The 1950 bloody war against communism in Korea, it would expunge, it would plague, Harry Truman's presidency. Many people consider that to be Truman's biggest mistake, when we look at Southeast Asia in general. The communist revolts from Indonesia, the Philippines, and Malaysia, they all rocked. And, President Eisenhower, he really looked at this and he came up with his own theory called the domino theory. If we let one nation fall to communism, they're all going to fall to communism. So anyway, Eisenhower continued this policy in containing communism, and he warned that if Vietnam fell to communism, the rest of Southeast Asia would soon follow. And, he makes this statement. You have a row of dominoes set up. You happen to the last one is a certainty that they will go over very, very quickly. So it's important to look at this. And here's kind of a picture representation, and I got this picture out of the lessons from Vietnam. You see all these nations in Southeast Asia, or, and you even look at India that had a high population during that time period. If you let one go, they all go. There was resistance. By 1954, the U.S. paid an extreme amount of aid for France's war effort. Lots of aid when it came to fighting communism. Still led to defeat after defeat. Okay. Money and equipment had limited abilities against Viet Minh's guerrilla tactics. And if we look back, earlier in this mini lecture, we know that Le Loi was the first Vietnamese emperor that would use these tactics and win. They attacked without warning with their own time frame and then escaped back in the jungle. And it was really difficult to see who was with us and who was against us, or within that area. The Battle of Dien Bien Phu, this is an important component. If you've ever seen the movie We Were Soldiers with Mel Gibson, it talks about the Dien Bien Phu aspect or battle at the beginning of this movie. This was France's last-ditch effort to lure the Viet Minh into a conventional battle, which that's kind of how the European powers understood how to fight, and the United States in many regards. 13,000 French troops were surrounded by 50,000 Viet Minh troops. The Americans will not let us down. The free world will not let us down is kind of what they're stating. But again, we offered money, but we were not going to offer, military, help within this venture. Eisenhower's reluctance to draw us into another Asian war was a huge reason that this happened in this regard. Okay, so it's important to look at that. We just got done with Korea. This was France's loss. Yeah, they would eventually lose, and they surrendered on May 7th, 1954. And this was a huge win for the Viet Minh, or the communist Vietnamese rebels in the north. Here's a picture of many of the French in the Battle of Dien Bien Phu as they're being taken over during that time frame. Then we get to the 5 P's of war, folks. So I've given you kind of a general background to this conflict as to why the Vietnamese were able to fight back. But you look at the stigma of the Vietnam War, and you look at any other war associated since. No one wants another Vietnam War or a Vietnam conflict. When you look at in terms of the military strategy or the United States in general history, the 5 P's of war are important, and we're going to be going over these just briefly here. You've already written down the definitions, yourselves, or I asked you to define them in your own words. And understand that I have the 5 P's listed here, and they are not listed in order of significance necessarily, as to why the United States became involved in this conflict. The first one is power. Nations often go to war to increase their power or to prevent their enemies from increasing their power. Some nations do this by attacking weaker neighbors. Others form alliances with other nations to build up their strength. Anytime that, whether it's the United States, Russia, China, when they're going to become involved in a conflict, sometimes these things take place. If you look at in current situation, you look at the southern border of the United States, Mexico, we often as a country exert our power, not necessarily by attacking militarily, but if you look at monetarily, we're still utilizing that component. So that's the first one, power. The second one is prestige. The desire to defend or advance a nation's prestige, that is a nation standing in the eyes of the world. So how do you look? In the eyes of the world is very important. This is a second factor that could lead to war. Oftentimes, if you see other nations, that are trying to vie for power, you'll see them build up in a certain area of the world. A lot of times they're saber rattling, especially in the Cold War. You look at Vietnam, you look at even the current conflicts with Russia and China and many other nations, a lot of it's saber rattling, or, they're hitting their chest. And, and a lot of times, these other nations look at the status of the leaders of the world and they're like, what are you going to do? And, the standing in the eyes of the world, it's important that you have a good, positive, look of yourself any time that you're leading the modern world. So, and again, we'll get back into power and prestige in a little bit more depth in days to come. Principles. Sometimes nations go to war to enforce cherished principles, such as ensuring human rights or the rights of vessels at sea. You look at Taiwan, you look at the Chinese Navy, going right beside the Straits of Taiwan recently, and it's still a pretty big issue when you look at the world today. You look at the Chinese of how they've handled this coronavirus outbreak, from human to human contact. It's definitely an issue. If you watch the news and you believe some of the news, I encourage you to go through like several different frameworks. Whether definitely look at the media as it is, and sometimes it's a little bit biased. And we'll do a lecture on bias later on. So principles. Profit. Nations go to war for profit. That is to advance their economic interests by protecting investments, securing raw materials, or gaining new markets for their exports. You look at profit. A lot of people say that the big powers they definitely get involved in conflicts, for oil or any other natural resource such as that. So it's important to look at that. Let's see. I think this is the final one. Yeah. Oh, I don't know what I did there. Let me fix it. Sometimes I go too fast. All right. Protection is the last of the 5 P's. When a nation is attacked or invaded by another nation, it usually will fight to protect its people and territory. You look at Pearl Harbor, you look at 9/11, and you see the United States becoming involved. And again, we look at the Vietnam conflict, and we'll talk about the Gulf of Tonkin incident that brought the United States involved in the full-scale conflict a little bit later on. But that was one of those aspects. Okay, a few more slides, folks, and then we'll call it a day on the very first mini lecture. United States background of involvement. It's important to look at this because it's very important. It's the longest war in U.S. history prior to Afghanistan and Iraq, because we've been involved in that for nearly 20 years. But the war itself, an official declaration of war after the Gulf of Tonkin resolution or Gulf of Tonkin incident. This conflict would last from 1965 to 1975. Nearly 60,000. This is an estimated version. It's more like 58,362, but 60,000 would be kind of our number of Americans dead. $600 billion would be the cost of the war. And if you look at, a thing called inflation in today's situation, it's in the trillions. But, many people said that it altered American society. There was a congressman that said, this war was like pouring money down a rat hole. That nothing was going to, come of it anyway. It was referred to by historians as the most divisive war in American history. And I definitely believe that. You look at the United States involvement, and you look at the cost that it took on America, and you look at how it shifted American policy, the post-Vietnam War era, and we can definitely look at that. So it's referred to as the most divisive war in American history. This will be our last slide. I know many of you are like saying, thank goodness he's done. He said this was a mini lecture and we're 26 minutes in. It's kind of fun. Presidents. Many people would look at this and they think Johnson to Ford. And this is simply not true. 6 presidents served during the Vietnam crisis, not the war, but the crisis. Truman, he would aid the French. He rejects Ho Chi Minh. Even Eisenhower footed nearly 80% of France's bill in the Vietnam War. So even Truman and Eisenhower are going to become involved in that. But the 6 presidents are Truman, Eisenhower, Kennedy, Johnson, Nixon, and Ford. Well, I hope you've enjoyed our first lecture. If you have any questions, email me, cbanks@centrally.org, and we can move forward. Be looking for a Zoom meeting on Tuesday this coming week. That's all I have, folks. Have a good day.